Good evening, folks, and welcome to yet another episode of It Came From Beyond the Mic podcast, which I'm sure is your favorite horror podcast by now. I'm your host, Cortez. I'd like to preface everything I'm about to talk about with a little spoiler warning. I talk about spoilers for every film I go over, and this week is no different. But also, before I actually talk about the movie I want to talk about this week, or I am talking about this week, I would like to say, this will mark the first episode where I have, ads in my podcast episodes, so I hope that's not a bother to anyone. How do I explain? So with Anchor, you can monetize your podcast, and that's through ad reads. So now I have ad reads in my podcast. And last week we had a sponsor, the Injection Shop, but the Anchor ads are a little different. Not that I mind the Injection Shop, which, by the way, you should check out the Injection Shop still. That is a very valid sponsor still. So I just wanted to give a little heads up to my listeners out there that there will be ad reads in my episodes now. I am not a sellout, I don't think, but I just felt like it was worth mentioning. It's kind of cool, at least to me. But regardless, this week we're talking about Scream, which Scream actually used to be my favorite horror movie. That is now since shifted to Halloween, because how can I not love the granddaddy of slasher films, you know? I guess that's what most people refer to Halloween as. But Scream is great because it's sort of a slasher love letter to horror films as well. And I'm sure most of you have heard of Scream, 1996, the OG Scream, Ghostface. Fucking love Ghostface, by the way. He's a great slasher. I feel like Scream has been talked about to death, and I'm no different. I gotta talk about it. I want to talk about it. It's a fantastic movie. Again, used to be my favorite horror. That's for a good reason, because it's a good movie. And I feel like maybe there's a stigma around Scream where it's maybe seen as the Pulp Fiction of horror movies, because it feels like everyone likes it. Everyone who feels like they're smart likes it. I don't know. I haven't seen Pulp Fiction, so of course I'm talking out of my ass. But I have seen Scream. Fuck, I've seen it twice now, because I watched it again for the podcast. I feel like I'm just retreading shit I've already talked about, so I apologize heavily. Damn if it didn't hold up, because again, it was a bit of a revisit. I watched it years ago, and I was like, oh, that was probably my favorite horror movie I've ever seen. And then I saw Halloween, and I fell in love with a lot of what Halloween does. And I love the Halloween series, actually, but in due time, I'll get around to series. For now, we're starting with the first film in a series. I'm starting small for this podcast, but that's neither here nor there. Well, actually, it's here, but that's for there. Haha. So Scream, right? It's pretty simple premise. Basically, a killer, Ghostface, has plagued this small town, and our main character, Sydney, is tasked with, hopefully unmasking the killer, trying to survive this whole ordeal. I think this is a good character movie. Not only is this a very tightly knit movie in everything that it accomplishes throughout, each action scene, I guess you could say action scene, I don't know. But it's clever. This movie is very clever. And again, I'm sure you know this. Not everyone has sucked off Scream once or twice, but here I am. I'm on my knees. I'm ready. I enjoy the characters a lot. They got pretty good personality for the most part, but I mostly care about Sydney. I'll get to some later characters a little bit later in the podcast because it comes into spoiler territory. I try to save spoilers for the mid to end point of the podcast episode, I don't know. No, I bounce around, that's a lie. Whatever. So Sydney is a character. She's a girl. A woman, I don't know. Stupid. I find her to be a complex character because she's also struggling with the murder of her mother, which happened a year prior to the events of Scream. So she's a character who has post-traumatic stress stuff. She has she has mental issues, and I feel bad for her because she's manipulated a lot throughout the film, which I will expand on because she has a boyfriend named Billy. Right? That was his name, Billy? Yes, Billy. Billy is a fucker. He seems like a good guy. Spoiler territory. I'll get into that. He seems like a good guy, but throughout the middle point of the film, he seems like an asshole to me. Because there's a line where he implies that after the death of Sydney's mother, she hasn't been the same, which makes sense. If you experience something as fucking awful as that, you would be a little shaken. You'd be a different person after that experience. But he's being an asshole about it. He's implying that it's oh, you want to have sex with me because of your mother. which, yes, this is true. She has intimacy issues because of this. I still think he's a fucking dick for saying that. That's part of the manipulation I feel that Sydney feels, or experiences rather, throughout this movie, as well as a lot of other things. But that one, because it's so real. It's not personal by any means, but because it's so like real versus the killer stuff in the movie, that line really stung me for some reason. I don't know. I felt very bad for Sydney because she's a pretty likable character. I feel like for the most part in horror movies, these final girl characters are pretty crafty. At the very least, they are lucky. You know, they're a protagonist, so I suppose you should like them to a good degree, which is great. I don't mind final girls. A lot of final girls are badasses. If you're not familiar with the term final girl, it's all in there. Final girl, like the sole survivor of a horror event, like fucking Laurie Strode from Halloween. Best example, because that's what I talked about on the podcast, whatever. Before I talk about the dastardly killings that take place in Scream, I'd actually like to do a little ad break if you don't mind. So, shout out to this week's sponsor, Anchor. Anchor is the platform I trust most to host this very podcast. Anchor's interface makes it very simple to post podcast episodes for listeners all over the internet. If you need an easy-to-use and free website to host your own podcast on, I'd say turn to Anchor. And for those of you tuning in on Spotify, just know that these episodes wouldn't be on Spotify without the help of Anchor. If this ad was what you needed to hear in order to get your own podcast going, then download the free Anchor app or visit the website at anchor.fm to get started. Once again, thank you to this week's sponsor, Anchor. So the killings that take place in Scream are some pretty iconic things, I would say. I'd argue one of the most iconic bits of this film is the opening, in which there's this girl, her name is Casey, if I'm not mistaken, and she's home alone one night, she's trying to make popcorn, but she keeps getting random calls. Well, rather, multiple calls from a random caller, and she's answering, and she's not sure of who this is. At first, it seems like a wrong number situation. Then it gets much more threatening. Her boyfriend is fucking duct tape tied up in her backyard, and the killer's threatening to kill him. She has to play a little game where she answers horror trivia. She gets them wrong, then her boyfriend dies. Spoiler, her boyfriend dies. And then Ghostface, the killer, breaks into her house. Well, it's actually really fucking brutal. They, like, stabs her, like, 3 times, and then they, like, hang her in the front yard. It's very brutal. It's actually a very heartbreaking scene because her parents also get home around the same time, in time to see their daughter fucking strung up like that. It's pretty bad, but at the same time, it's very iconic for the dialogue and actions taken. It's really interesting. This, again, is a movie that plays off of other horror movies and references them. Like I said, with the horror trivia, there's other little, like, references where Sydney is talking about, like, oh, horror movie protagonists are stupid. They run upstairs when they, like, that's how you get cornered. And then she immediately does the same thing when she's presented with a killer in the house situation, like, just moments after, as well as one of Sydney's friends, Randy. He's watching Halloween at one point, and he's like, look behind you, Laurie Strode, the killer's right behind you, when Ghostface is indeed right behind him. I'm sure myself and others regard this movie kind of as a slasher love letter to the horror genre. Just because, you know, it's not afraid to name drop things, and that is one of my favorite parts from the end part of the film, where there's a house party, but the dude Randy has put on Halloween for everyone to watch together. Eventually, most of the party goers leave, but then Randy's, like, watching the movie, and like I said, I fucking love Halloween, so it made me really happy to see Halloween on the TV, especially hearing all the little horror stinger noises, if that makes any sense. Like the little pieces of the soundtrack from Halloween, like the Michael Myers do-do-do, like scary noise. To kind of further try and explain that in a coherent way. There are such other kills, like the one where Sydney's friend Tatum tries to crawl through a, like, cat door in a garage, and then she gets, like, stuck halfway through. Ghostface hits the garage door button, it goes up, she dies. Which, that death is maybe comedic to some. It's pretty gruesome. I don't know. A lot of this is played straight for the most part. It's weird. It's self-aware, but it also knows to, like, be grounded in a way. This movie's very tightly knit. Very, very well-written movie. Seeing, like, the Tatum garage door death, it made me think of the Final Destination movies, which I think I'll have to tackle at some point down the line of this podcast. I think I will. Maybe I'll do that. Probably do that sometime in April, maybe. Perhaps. I don't know. Do people even like those movies that much? I'll probably talk about them. It's kind of a childhood thing in a fucked up way for me. But that's later. That's for later. I'm talking about Scream, baby. Who's ready to talk spoilers? Because I think I'm ready to talk spoilers. In the finale of the movie, it is revealed that Billy, Sydney's boyfriend, is actually the killer. But there's two men working on the job. So I feel like I should have mentioned character names earlier in the podcast. I apologize. Whatever. So there's Sydney's other friend, Stu. So Stu and Billy are actually both Ghostface. They took turns wearing the Ghostface costume and killing people. They took turns like calling on people on the phone using the voice changer thing that they had and like intimidating people. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of film like scene breakdowns of this movie. And in any given scene, you can actually tell who is in the costume based on how competent they are at killing their victim. So Billy is more competent than Stu is. So if you see Ghostface being a bumbling fuck in the movie, that's actually Stu in the costume, which is so interesting and again adds to the well-written nature of this movie. So I mentioned the manipulation of Sydney, and that actually ties to Billy, not just with the thing that he said about like, oh, you want to have sex with me because you're dead mom. So there's that line, which is an emotional manipulation, but there's also Sydney thinks that Billy could be the killer based on an earlier interaction where she's chased by Stu in the Ghostface costume, and then eventually she gets in a safe spot, locks Stu out of a room, Stu fucks off, then Billy jumps in through a window, and he like embraces Sydney, but his cell phone falls out of his pocket, and she looks at it, and she's very nervous because she had been getting a call from some anonymous number, and she was like, oh fuck, so that could have been Billy calling me. Billy goes to jail, but then they can't prove it through like, they check the cell phone call logs or whatever that you want to call that, and it's like Billy's proven innocent, so then he's kind of manipulating Sydney. He's like, you don't think I'm still the killer, do I? And she's like, no, I love you. And then she, like, she's racked with guilt that honestly she was right, so I feel immensely bad for Sydney. She's just manipulated all around. However, in the end of this movie, Stu and Billy reveal that they also are actually the ones who murdered Sydney's mom a year prior. And then a year later, they were going to do their whole plan was to frame Sydney's dad into tricking the town into thinking that he had a murder spree because of the death anniversary of his wife. And there's a lot more motives and a lot of nitty gritty things in the movie that I have not mentioned for sake of time, I suppose. It's interesting. I'm also kind of leaving it out because if you want to watch this movie, go ahead. I would very much recommend this movie, especially for those of you who already like horror movies. Maybe even if you don't like horror movies that much, maybe watch this, understand the well-written nature of it, and then also because it like name drops horror movies, you could be like, oh, that's like maybe I'll watch that movie next, It's just a good fucking movie, like, Jesus Christ. I'm in love with Ghostface design. Because this is separate from the movie, but they put Ghostface in a video game that I play called Dead by Daylight, which is kind of like a slasher game in a way. Just look it up if you're interested in that. But they added him as DLC, and I fucking love Ghostface. That mask. Anywho, Stu and Billy are actually tag team killers. But then Sydney and her father, through very crafty means, escape them, kill Billy, kill Stu. It's a whole bloodbath at this house party. Again, most of the guests have left. Sydney and her friend Randy survives. It's a pretty happy ending, I would say. The movie ends pretty quick. It doesn't get too much into what happens afterwards, but it's a good ending. It's a happy ending, I would say. There is much relief, and I like Scream. I really do. I love this movie. Like, if I was to rank horror movies, I guess Halloween would be number 1, and Scream, I think, deserves to be number 2. Probably Murder Party number 3. I'd say if I'm looking at it from like, I'm a big brain film guy standpoint, yeah, I guess that list would make sense. But that's just my top 3. As this podcast goes on, I might love even more and more horror movies, and that's the beauty of it. Regardless, I believe those are my thoughts on Scream. So I think I'll go ahead and wrap up this episode, but I thank you all very much for listening. I hope that you too maybe will check out Scream. I was your host, Cortez. I hope you enjoyed listening to me. I'll see you all next time, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Good night.